All right, let's talk about the origin story of something we all kind of take for granted these days in D&D, the adventure module. It is a wild story of innovation, some serious skepticism, and one of the most bizarre, deadly dungeons you can imagine. This thing literally changed everything. But first, just picture this. It's 1975. You're the dungeon master. You've got your rule books, you've got your dice, and that's it. Every map, every monster, every single trap and piece of the story, you had to make it all up from scratch. Every single session. That was just how D&D worked back then.
So yeah, that's what it was like. A world without adventures. In the mid-70s, the thinking, and this came straight from the top, from D&D's creators, was that DMs were supposed to be these solitary artists. You were just expected to build your entire world from the ground up, from the biggest story arcs down to where every last goblin was hiding. The idea of buying a prepackaged adventure, it just wasn't a thing.
Now, we gotta be clear about something here. Palace of the Vampire Queen wasn't the very first D&D scenario ever written down. Not at all. There were examples in the rulebooks, you had adventures hidden inside supplements, and even dungeons printed in magazines. But what happened in June 1976 was different. It was the first adventure ever sold as its own thing, a standalone product you could just buy. It literally created a whole new category for the hobby. But here's the biggest obstacle, and it's a huge one. The co-creator of Dungeons & Dragons, Gary Gygax himself, was totally against the idea. He just didn't believe in it. He thought that any real DM would want to create everything themselves. In his mind, why would anyone pay for a pre-made adventure when they could just, write one on their own? He was convinced they wouldn't sell. So with that skepticism coming from the very top, you had this big gap in the market. And that's where our heroes come in. A tiny company out of California called We Warriors, run by Pete and Judy Kerestan. They saw an opportunity that the creators of D&D were completely missing. They saw a problem that needed solving, and they decided they were going to be the ones to solve it.
And this is a really important detail that often gets glossed over. Judy Kerestan's role as co-author makes Palace of the Vampire Queen the very first D&D adventure to be co-written by a woman. That's a huge milestone, a super important early step in making sure it wasn't just one type of person designing these incredible worlds.
So what was their big idea? Honestly, it was pure convenience. Before, the DM had this insane amount of work, inventing worlds, drawing every map by hand, writing every single encounter. But what the Kerestans created, what they brilliantly called a Dungeon Master's Kit, changed all that. All of a sudden, you had a ready-to-go scenario, maps for you and your players, and all the encounters laid out. It was a revolution in a little plastic bag.
And let's break down two of the most genius things they did here. First, the dual maps. You got one map for the DM with all the secrets, and a second, totally blank one you could just hand to your players. Bam. Hours of tedious map drawing at the table, just gone. Second was the tabular key. Instead of long paragraphs of text, they used a simple table. Room number, what monsters are in it, and any special notes. All the info you needed, right there. So simple, but so effective.
And you gotta love the story of how these were made. It just captures that indie spirit of the 70s perfectly. The first printing was a total do-it-yourself job. Later, when TSR, the company that actually made D&D, took over distribution, they'd find copies with missing pages. And their solution? They'd just walk over to the office Xerox machine, make some really streaky, obvious copies, and stuff them in the package. Can you imagine? Okay, so we've talked about the how, but what was actually in this thing? What was this adventure like to play? Well, you should probably buckle up, because it was absolutely lethal, completely illogical, and totally legendary. This was a pretty big deal, because before this module, most D&D was really just about one thing: getting loot. You went into a dungeon to get rich, period. Palace of the Vampire Queen helped pioneer one of the very first rescue the princess plots. A dwarven king's daughter gets kidnapped, he offers a reward, and for one of the first times, players had a real moral objective beyond just grabbing treasure. So you take the quest, you battle your way through all these dungeon levels, and you finally make it to the throne room. And what's waiting for you there? 35 vampires. No, that's not a typo, not one, not five, 35 of them. And just when you're trying to wrap your head around that, it gets worse. Standing right there with those 35 vampires is a Balrog. Yes, that Balrog. This was way back before the Tolkien estate sued and TSR had to change the name to Baylor. So yeah, good luck with that fight. And the dungeon was every bit as deadly as that final fight.
Case in point, on the second level, there was a chest. You try to open it, a giant stone block falls from the ceiling. There was no saving throw. You didn't get a roll to spot the trap. Your character and anyone else nearby was just gone. Instant death. Welcome to 1970s D&D.
But here's the thing, and this is key. It wasn't just mean for the sake of being mean. It was actually a puzzle. It was designed to reward clever players, not just strong ones. See, the dungeon followed all the classic vampire rules, which meant all 35 of those vampires were programmed to run away from things like mirrors and crosses. And even better, on level 4, there was a literal garlic garden, so smart players could stock up on everything they needed to survive that insane final battle.
So all of this stuff, right? The killer traps, the weird solutions, the over-the-top monsters, it all points to a certain kind of design philosophy. And today, we'd call it a funhouse dungeon. It's a style where nothing really needs to make sense, because the whole point is just to be surprising. So what the heck is a funhouse dungeon? Well, it's a design that basically throws realism right out the window. It doesn't care if the ecology makes sense. What it cares about is creating a series of wild, bizarre, and totally disconnected encounters. The goal isn't to build a believable world, it's to keep the players on their toes, constantly wondering, what could possibly be next?
And Palace of the Vampire Queen is maybe the perfect example of this. So get this. Deep inside this deadly dungeon, there was a wizard.
And this wizard was just peacefully running a little retail magic shop, you know, selling potions, scrolls, the usual stuff.
In a pitch-black dungeon that he shared with murderous orcs, giant slugs, and, oh yeah, an army of 35 vampires and their pet Balrog. There's no explanation for it. He's just there, open for business.
But my absolute favorite example of this gonzo style, there's a room that contains, and this is a direct quote, 15 house cats. Not monsters, not illusions, just 15 regular cats. Why? Who knows? It's weird, and that's the whole point. That's funhouse logic.
So this completely bizarre, super deadly, often illogical adventure gets published, and it becomes a massive runaway success. So let's talk about how this one little product, an idea that D&D's own creator thought was a total dud, ended up changing the entire hobby forever.
You can literally trace the dominoes falling from this one thing. First, Palace of the Vampire Queen is a huge hit, which proves there is a massive demand for this kind of product. Second, seeing those sales, TSR is forced to drop its skepticism and immediately starts making its own modules. That leads directly to iconic adventures like the Against the Giant series. And finally, from that, an entire industry of people writing and selling adventures is born, all from this one little experiment. When you boil it all down, Palace of the Vampire Queen totally shook up the hobby because it solved a huge problem. It saved the dungeon master's time. It proved how valuable a good toolkit could be, which I think leaves us with a really interesting question to chew on. What's going to be the next great disruption that saves DM's time and changes how we all play this game?